If you are a fan of Christian fantasy, then you have come to the right place. Today I'm going to share with you my ranking of one of the best Christian fantasy series of all times. Today I'm going to rank all 12 books in Brian Davis's epic series, the Dragons in Our Midst / Oracles of Fire / Children of the Bard series. Now I say slash because technically this is 3 different series, but they all build off of each other, all set in the same world with, for the most part, the same characters. So, unfortunately, there's not a good term to describe the series as a whole, so I just have to describe all 3 and use the word slash in between. This is one of my all-time favorite series. Brian Davis does a fantastic job creating this complex world and mythology, and I'm so excited to share with you my ranking of all 12 books in the series. Welcome to Caleb's Bookshelf. So this series is one that I have read many, many times because it has such a complex and captivating world with engaging characters. I love stories that have intense memorability and engaging characters, and this checks all of the boxes. So if you are looking for a Christian fantasy series, this is one that I'd highly recommend you checking out. But, of course, some books in the series are better than others, so let's go ahead and jump into our ranking. At the bottom of the list, because unfortunately there does have to be a bottom, we have The Seventh Door, which is the 3rd book in the 3rd series. This is set much later than the original events of the series, and most of the books in this 3rd series, the Children of the Bard series, are lower on the list. Not that this series is bad, but whereas in the first 2 series, Brian Davis really makes sure that you're connected with the characters. The newer characters that he introduces in the series are harder to connect with and less engaging. Whenever we see some of the older characters, everyone gets all excited. But the newer characters that are the primary focus of the series don't really stand out. They're kind of just similar to other characters we've already seen. And so it's harder to really connect with some of these books, but they're still fairly good. This book in particular ranks the last, mostly because of the limitations of the genre. So the Dragons in Our Midst / Oracles of Fire / Children of the Bard series is primarily written to young adults. While any age can absolutely enjoy the series, it is designed with a slightly younger age range where Brian Davis doesn't want to dive into too graphic or controversial topics. And so that is where the biggest limitation comes with this book. So let's read the description. An apocalypse approaches, and only Matt Bannister and his mother Bonnie can stop it. Forced to participate in the demon Tamil's scheme, Matt, Bonnie, and Darcy must travel to 7 destinations. Behind each of the 7 doors, they find a unique brand of evil that is designed to weaken Bonnie's soul-healing song and bring about God's wrath upon the earth. So, fantastic concept. So this book is done very well, despite the fact that it is written primarily to young adults. But because of that limitation, he can't really dive into the complexities and darkness that it could have had. And because of this, his whole concept for this 3rd series in particular is essentially, spoiler-free version is that these demons are trying to essentially bring about the end of the world, the apocalypse, the day of the Lord, second coming, all of that, and basically bring upon the end of the world. And so, as a part of this, we have all of these temptations set up to bring about the greater evil in the world. And this is a very interesting and engaging concept, but it has to be within the limitations of the fact that this is a young adult novel. And so a lot of the descriptions and events that happen are very vague and not as in depth as they could have been because of the audience. And so that is why this book is at the bottom of the list. Not that it is a bad story at all, um, it just had limitations on it. Now, for number 11 at the list, we have also from the Children of the Bard series, The Mouth of Elijah. Now, this I like better than the third book in the series. This is the second one. I think that it does a better job at getting us to connect with some of the characters and keeping the story engaging. However, the reason I've placed this book lower on the list is because we had a really nice happy ending at the end of the second series, and it is just so discouraging to see what some of these characters and what happens to this beautiful world and all these amazing characters. The destruction in this book is sad. As a fan of the world and the characters and all of these amazing things in the story, it was painful to see all of the destruction that happens in the book, and so I didn't necessarily love that. Also, there's one particular scene that's kind of the main focal point, that has a cool concept but is done in a rather confusing way, so it's a bit unclear what's going on or why the scene is important until after the scene has already happened. And so while it's a great book, I think overall I didn't enjoy it compared to some of the other ones. Moving on from the third series, we have the very first book in the Dragons in Our Midst world, and that is Dragons Rising. So, Dragons Rising is the first book, and it was also the first published novel by Brian Davis. And because of that, some of the pacing is a little off. Some of the writing and descriptions are a little more lackluster compared to some of his later work, just because he was still refining how to be a effective storyteller. And so this book isn't bad by any means, but it is by far one of the weaker links in the series just because a lot of the mythology hadn't been created yet. And a lot of what he wanted to do felt incomplete because he was still learning how to tell a story. So, fantastic book. Highly recommend the first book in the series. However, that is just a launching point for much, much better. Next up on the list, we have the fourth book in the original series, The Tears of a Dragon. Now, this book is engaging, it has some really intense moments, and has a good send-off for the original series. However, compared to some of the other finales in this world, it is kind of lackluster. The big final battle between the dragons and all the main characters versus the demons and all of these crazy creatures is done fairly well, but compared to what comes next, it is a bit lackluster. And so while it is a good book, the mythology that is set up in the second series is what really makes this series shine as a whole and makes it feel like a complete and vivid world. Next up on the list, we have the very final entry in the series, that is the Omega Dragon. As the last book, it had a lot of things that it had to wrap up and live up to, and this carries out a trend that I've seen in a few Christian novels, specifically Christian fantasy, and that is where in the last book or the last few books of a long-running series, the author wants to have a big epic conclusion, so he tries to throw in the Second Coming / Day of the Lord. And while that can work, that can certainly work, as a whole, it can be very difficult to pull off such a complex and intense finale because there are so many prophecies and so much that we don't yet know about what this Day of the Lord is going to look like. And so having this apocalyptic finale where Jesus returns at the very end is very difficult to pull off just because of all of the things that have to happen for this story to make sense. And so having a epic apocalyptic conclusion crammed into a overall series with already established characters can be very difficult to do. Overall, I think this book did fairly well at it. I would be curious to see what would have happened if he hadn't gone that route, because I think it is certainly not my favorite way of ending the series. But overall, for the concept that he had, I think he did it well, and he pulled it off despite the complexity. Um, on a side note, all the other books have this format where you have the nice picture in the front, and then it's like black, and then the words on the back, which is nice, and I like that. And this book completely ruined that nice formula by having a picture run along the entire book cover. Not that everything needs to match, but everything needs to match, and it bothers me because even though this is an epic battle scene, it doesn't match. Now, the next book on the list is Enoch's Ghost, which is the second book in the Oracles of Fire series, that second series within the larger world. And overall, the Oracles of Fire is absolutely the best in the best series in that world compared to the other two series. And while this is the weakest link in that second series, that is by far a knock on it. This book takes one of our atheist characters and gives her this complex and engaging storyline where she's having to deal with the fear of dying and surrendering her intellect and her perception of God as this vengeful, angry beast wanting to devour her. This is done very well, and the complexities, as Brian Davis explores themes of judgment and hell and fear, are done incredibly well. So overall, this book is very well done, and even though it's not one of the top books of the list, that does not mean that it is not a worthy link in a great overall series. Next up, we have The Song of the Ovulum. And this is the first book in the Children of the Bard series, that third series. And this book introduces us to some new characters, some new storylines, but in similar fashion to the first book in the Oracles of Fire series, which we will get to later in this list. The Song of the Ovulum has some split timelines, so it actually is taking place over thousands of years, starting pre-flood and going to present day. This type of story is very complex, and it was very difficult to do, to chop up and to have all of these storylines going on over such a long period of time. But it successfully introduces new mythology to the world, and while it's not done as well as the first book in the Oracles of Fire series, it does still pull off that trick that Brian Davis did. And create some fantastic world building. And now we get into the top 5 with The Last of the Nephilim. This is the third book in the Oracles of Fire series. And in this, everything starts to come to a head. Kind of the pattern that Brian Davis follows with these books is book 1 is introduction to the mythology. Book 2 is basically a standalone novel within that world with the mythology, with the characters, continuing the story. The third book is everything starts to ramp up, and it's really a part 1. And usually ends with the characters losing in some way. And then the fourth book is the epic final conclusion. Now, what this series really shines in is the fact that it has over a dozen characters with all of their own storylines across technically 3 different worlds. And while all of this chaos is going on, and we're exploring all of this rich mythology connected to thousands of years of history in King Arthur times and pre-flood times and all of this chaos going on, this book successfully explores all of those different storylines and characters and builds up the action leading to that epic final conclusion that we're going towards at the end of the Oracles of Fire series. Next up, we have The Candlestone, which is the second book in the original series, the Dragons in Our Midst series. And this is also the second book that Brian Davis ever published. Considering that this is the second book he ever published, this book is ranked very highly on the list. This is where we finally get to meet one of the best characters of the series, Ashley. This is where we are introduced to a ton of different storylines, where we get the beautiful poem from Bonnie that is replayed throughout the series multiple times. This is where Brian Davis really starts to show how he can create this complex mythology while connecting that to the characters and the themes. So overall, the main character Billy is having to grapple with these themes, while Bonnie is essentially kidnapped and forced to grapple with her past. We meet some very complex but sympathetic villains, and overall, this story is just so well done. Next up, we have The Circles of Seven, which is the third book in the Dragons in Our Midst series. So in the first book in the series, we're introduced to the fact that there are these descendants of dragons that have different powers. So our main character can breathe fire, the other one has wings, all of these other things, and they are descendants of dragons. And then in the second book, we get a little more built onto it, a little more of the mythology. We meet some more of the dragons and some of the backstory. But in this third book, this is where things actually start to take shape of the broader world. This is where we meet all of the different complex worlds within this story, and we meet some of the other villains. While it was clear that a lot of the mythology that came later hadn't been developed yet in this third book, this is kind of where everything begins. But even without that mythology, The Circles of Seven is a fantastic book where our main characters are traveling through these different realms, and meanwhile, our side characters are starting to get connected and trying to help them out. This is where we get one of the cutest couples in the series. And for a long time, this was actually my favorite book in the series. But that was replaced when we start to get into the Oracles of Fire series. So next up on the list, we have The Eye of the Oracle, which is the first book in the Oracles of Fire series. And what is incredible about this book is that it takes place over thousands of years. So much of the story is world building and creating these new complex characters and locations and themes and weird mystical stuff, all the crazy fantasy things. But this story, despite taking place over thousands of years and having a ton of different characters overall, it is done masterfully well, where you have this thread of these new and old characters coming together. This is where we meet Sapphira Adi and Elam, and those are two of the best characters in the entire series overall. This is where so much of the first series is explained and built upon in a way that doesn't feel like it completely changes everything. It just makes it so much more rich and vivid. And so I love The Eye of the Oracle because this is a story that should not have worked. With so much complexity, with so many different characters to juggle, and themes and plot points, and with a length of over 600 pages, this is a story that really shouldn't have worked. But it does, and it is done masterfully. And so, The Eye of the Oracle lands at the number 2 spot in the list of the entire series. But it is not number 1. And that belongs to The Bones of Makaidos, which is the last book in the Oracles of Fire series. And it was originally the ending of the series as a whole before we got the Children of the Bard series. Now, while I think the Children of the Bard series is good, it's hard to fully appreciate it just because The Bones of Makaidos is such a fantastic ending. In fact, I'd say that it is maybe not my favorite book, but it is my favorite ending of a series because we have thousands of years of history and dozens of characters, and yet all of the storylines are woven together and masterfully concluded in a way that shouldn't have been possible. With the epic final battle that is done so well, and all of these characters that we've spent the past 7 books getting to know and love, this book wraps up all of their stories so well, and in a way that shouldn't have been possible. This book gives us a satisfying ending to everything that had happened before. While, yes, we have the Children of the Bard series that come after, The Bones of Makaidos really feels like a conclusion to the series. And I won't spoil anything, but there is a triple wedding that happens at the end of the book that is done masterfully well. The action, the dialogue, the characters, everything in this book is done so well that you could tell that God was working in Brian Davis as he was writing this, helping him complete the story and finish it well. And so there you have it. There is my ranking of all 12 books in the Dragons in Our Midst / Oracles of Fire / Children of the Bard series by Brian Davis. I hope that if you haven't read this series, this gets you interested in checking it out. It is fantastic and engaging and complex and intense. And if you have read this series, let me know in the comments what your ranking would be. Which book was your favorite and your least favorite? And who is your favorite character? I can tell you that my favorite character is probably either Alam or Sapphira 80 or Billy or Bonnie or Walter or Ashley. Oh shoot, there's too many good characters. Or Professor Charles, or Enoch. Maybe we can leave Enoch off the list. Yeah, so all the characters are my favorite apparently. But that just speaks to how good this series is at creating complex and interesting characters that connect with you, and then throwing them into all of these crazy storylines and events and epic fantasy-esque storylines. So if you haven't yet, check out this series by Brian Davis. If you have read it, let me know what you think of it. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with either what your favorite book was from the series or what your favorite Christian fantasy series is. See you next time!